the Aircraft Accident Investigation Podcast. Episode 1. Loss of control and collision with terrain involving a Cessna 182. In the early evening of 23rd of September 2013, the student pilot of a Cessna 182 Romeo aircraft, registered Alpha Uniform Tango, was conducting solo night circuit consolidation training at Hamilton Airport in Victoria, Australia. At about 18:45 local time, following a pre-flight briefing, the student pilot and qualified flight instructor commenced dual circuit training on runway 35 in order for the instructor to assess the student's proficiency prior to the student conducting solo night circuits on that runway. It was reported that when the aircraft took off, the light was fading, and by the end of the second circuit, it was completely dark. After 4 circuits, the flight instructor was satisfied with the student's performance and instructed them to conduct a full-stop landing to allow the instructor to exit the aircraft. The student pilot then commenced solo night visual circuits. The instructor observed some of the student pilot's solo landings and reported that those landings were normal. The instructor reported proceeding inside the school where they heard an engine noise consistent with that of Alpha Uniform Tango and observed the red tail light of an aircraft pass by the window in a slight climb. The instructor estimated that this aircraft was about 100 to 150 feet above the runway at that time. The instructor recalled hearing a radio call from the student pilot shortly after, indicating that they were going around. At 19:46 local time, 2 other witnesses who were walking to the school from the nearby hangar observed an aircraft turning right with a descent angle of about 30 degrees, followed by a collision with the terrain. The pilot was not heard to make any distress call on the aircraft's radio. The student pilot was fatally injured and the aircraft was destroyed by the impact and post-impact fire. Following the collision with the terrain, the witnesses immediately telephoned emergency services. In response, a search was commenced by Victoria Police and the aircraft was located at 19:57 local time. Fire and ambulance vehicles arrived at the site soon after. Personal information. The student pilot was undertaking training as part of a cadet scheme associated with an airline based at the Southwest Victoria. The flying school used an integrated training syllabus designed to train and prepare students for positions as first officers with the airline. The pilot had completed 8 months of the 18-month training course. At the time of the accident, the pilot held a student pilot's license with the appropriate aircraft endorsements to operate the aircraft and had passed their general flying progress test on 29th of April 2013. The pilot held a valid Class 1 aviation medical certificate issued by the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, CASA, without restrictions. The student pilot had accumulated a total flying experience of 135.5 hours, of which 60 hours were flown in the previous 90 days. The pilot's total experience on the Cessna 182 was 34.6 hours, of which 24.6 hours were accumulated in the last 90 days. Prior to the flight that night, the pilot had accumulated 4.7 hours of night flying experience, including 1.8 hours solo. The student was conducting night solo consolidation training in order to meet the requirement for the 10 hours of night flying experience prior to undertaking their instrument rating flight test. The students' night circuit training was all conducted at Hamilton Airport and their logbook contained an entry, made by the operator's chief flight instructor on 26th of August 2013, certifying that the student met the night VFR handling requirements for unrated pilots of the Civil Aviation Regulations 1988. These requirements detailed the minimum level of instrument flight proficiency for the student to conduct solo night circuits. Aircraft information. The aircraft was a high-wing, fixed undercarriage, single-engine, propeller-driven airplane. Its maintenance release was destroyed in the post-impact fire. A review of the aircraft's maintenance records did not identify any defects or unserviceability equipment prior to the flight. A copy of the maintenance release showed it was issued in the Instrument Flight Rules category on the 17th of September 2013 for 12 months or 100 hours flight time, whichever occurred first. The aircraft had accumulated about 32 hours since the issue of the maintenance release. The aircraft was fitted with an emergency transmitter that was destroyed during the impact sequence and post-impact fire. The Cessna 182 is fitted with wing flaps that can be extended to assist control and performance in low-speed flight, including during takeoff and landing. According to the aircraft manufacturer, the approved range of flap extension for landing was between their being fully retracted at 0 degrees and fully extended 40 degrees. In the Cessna 182, the wing flap lever and the position indicator are located to the lower right of the center control panel. The instructor reported that the flap setting was illuminated by a nearby cockpit light. Weight and balance. It was estimated that at the time of the accident, the aircraft's weight and balance were within the operational limits of the aircraft. Meteorological information. The Aerodrome forecast for Hamilton Airport predicted high cloud and the wind to be almost aligned with the runway 35 at 15 knots, with gusts to 28 knots for the duration of the intended training. From 2100, the wind was forecast to change to a westerly direction and reduce to 14 knots. Moderate turbulence was forecast at the circuit altitude throughout the forecast period. Other pilots who were also operating in the circuit at the time reported experiencing light turbulence in the circuit and that the westerly crosswind increased at circuit altitude. This necessitated adjustment headings to correctly position the aircraft in the circuit pattern. Last light at the accident site was at 1856 local time, and the moon did not rise until 22:28. There was little celestial light due to high cloud and no moon. Ground lighting was minimal to the north of the airport, and other pilots who were flying in the circuit at the time reported that it was really dark night. However, this level of illumination was reported normal when flying it from Hamilton Airport at night. Wreckage and impact information. The wreckage trail was orientated on a bearing of 086 degrees, consistent with a right turn through 96 degrees from the runway heading of 350 degrees following the go-around. The first impact was 650 metres from the upwind end of the runway 35 on a bearing of 061. Based on ground scale measurements, at impact the aircraft was descending and banked to the right with a slight nose-down attitude at a minimum speed of 100 knots or 185 km per hour. The aircraft came to rest 115 metres after the first ground impact. The engine separated from the fuselage after impact and travelled a further 150 metres on a bearing of 094 degrees. The aircraft was severely damaged by post-impact fire. No evidence was found of any pre-impact faults that could have influenced the aircraft, nor was there any indication of an in-flight breakup. Damage to the surrounding vegetation indicated that aviation fuel was liberated from the wreckage about 70 metres after the first point of impact. All the major components of the aircraft were identified except for the nose wheel. The engine separated from the fuselage during the impact sequence and was unaffected by the fire. On-site examination of the engine did not identify any faults that would have prevented normal operation. Propeller damage was consistent with the engine producing significant power at impact. The wing flap actuator had been found in the fully extended position at impact. During normal circuit operations, the flaps would generally be fully retracted on the upwind leg of the circuit. The wing flap control system was unable to be examined due to the damage sustained during the post-impact breakup and fire. The elevator trim tabs were found in a neutral position. However, due to the extensive disruption of the aircraft and its systems, the position of the trim at impact could not be determined. Medical and pathological information. The post-mortem examination. The forensic pathologist who conducted the post-mortem examination concluded that the student pilot succumbed to injuries sustained during the accident sequence. The examination also identified a congenital anomaly with the pilot's heart. In the report, the pathologist stated that the possibility that the accident was precipitated by a cardiac event could not be completely excluded. A CASA aviation medical specialist advised that the standard aviation medical examination procedure for a person of the pilot's age may not have detected the condition. Toxicology results did not identify any substance that could have impaired the pilot's performance. Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. The student pilot's medical history included prior treatment for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, and the pilot last filled a prescription for medication to treat these symptoms of ADHD 23 months before the accident, or 15 months before beginning their cadetship. It could not be determined if the pilot was still affected by the condition at the time of the accident, as no specialist aviation medical assessments were performed following the cessation of the medication. The CASA Designated Aviation Medical Examiner clinical guidelines advise the following effects of the condition with the potential to affect aviation operators: premature and ill-considered actions, restlessness and excessive of movement causing distraction, impaired split attention affecting multitasking and situational awareness. Advice was sought from 2 medical specialists as to the likelihood of the student pilot still having symptoms of the conditions at the time of the accident, based on the reported behaviour of the pilot during flight training. Opinion was also sought on the potential for the condition to have influenced the accident. However, due to the limited available information, neither was able to provide conclusive advice. In order for CASA to issue an aviation medical certificate to a pilot with a history of ADHD, CASA requires the applicant to be absent of symptoms for a minimum of 6 months after completing treatment. There's also a requirement of ongoing surveillance of the pilot for a period of time, determined on a case-by-case basis of up to 5 years. Information regarding this process is published on the CASA website at www.casa.gov.au. For reasons that could not be conclusively established, CASA was unaware of the student pilot's treatment for ADHD. As a result, CASA was unable to determine whether the pilot was free of symptoms prior to beginning their airline pilot cadet scheme and consider an ongoing surveillance of the pilot. The chief flying instructor reported that the flying school was made aware during the recruitment process that the student had been previously diagnosed with ADHD. The student was told to report this condition to their designated aviation medical examiner, and it was assumed by the instructor that there were no ongoing risks associated with the ADHD. The student had passed the Class 1 medical examination and his performance as a student was considered satisfactory. Operational information. Go-around procedure. A go-around may be initiated by a pilot when an aircraft is on an approach to land. A go-around is intended to change an aircraft's flight profile from a descending approach or landing configuration to a climb in a climbing configuration. A go-around procedure is considered a normal procedure, and although it's not often required, it should not result in an increased risk. The flying school taught students that when their aircraft was descending through the height of 300 feet above ground level on approach to land, the pilot should initiate a go-around unless the aircraft was within 10 knots of the correct airspeed, the aircraft was established on the extended runway centerline, the approach profile was aligned with the visual approach slope indicator, aircraft was configured to land. Flap settings. The aircraft's wing flaps were found to have probably been in the fully extended 40-degree position at impact. The instructor who approved the student pilot for night solo circuits that night reported that the student had been trained and observed to conduct landings at night with a maximum of 20 degrees flap extension. It was further reported that the students were trained to use full flap extension in certain circumstances, including short-field landings and practice forced landings during the day. Practice forced landings would include a go-around from a full flap extension configuration. According to the flying school's integrated training syllabus, practice forced landings were not conducted at night. At 40-degree flap extension, the aircraft can be flown at a particular airspeed with a lower nose attitude than when conducting the same manoeuvre with a less degree of flaps, or with flaps retracted. Cessna advised that a go-around from a trimmed aircraft with 40-degree flap extension would require about 20 kilos of forward control yoke force to maintain 55 knots. About 25 kilograms of forward control yoke force is required at 20-degree flap extension in the same scenario. Cessna also advised that on the night, the aircraft's climb performance at 40-degree flap extension would have been about half that expected if the flaps had been fully retracted. It was reported the pilot was trained to retract the flaps in 10-degree stages during a go-around, removing the force required on the control yoke. Spatial disorientation. Overview. Spatial disorientation occurs when a pilot does not correctly sense the position, motion, and attitude of an aircraft in relation to the surface of the Earth. It's often simply described as the inability to determine which way is up, although the effects of disorientation can be considerably more subtle than this description. Pilots obtain information about their orientation from their visual system, their eyes, which can obtain information from a range of cues outside the aircraft and relevant flight instruments inside the aircraft. The vestibular system, which consists of the balance organs located in the inner ear. The semicircular canals provide information about angular and rotational accelerations in the normal yaw, lateral pitch, and longitudinal roll axis. And otolith organs provide information about linear accelerations. The somatosensory system, which includes a range of receptors in the muscle, tendons, joints, and skin that sense gravity and other pressures on the body. Such perceptions are often known as seat in the pants aspect of flying. The visual system generally provides about 80% of a person's raw orientation information, with the remainder provided by the vestibular and somatosensory systems, both of which are prone to misinterpretations and illusions during the flight. Although the visual system can overcome these limitations, the risk of spatial disorientation is significantly increased if the relevant visual clues are absent, ambiguous, or not attended to. The nature of spatial disorientation accidents. Almost all pilots will experience spatial disorientation at some time, but the instances are usually recognized and do not result in adverse consequences. Nevertheless, spatial disorientation has always been involved in a significant portion of aviation accidents, particularly those with more serious consequences. When spatial disorientation does result in an accident, it's usually in the form of control flight into terrain or in-flight loss of control, resulting in collision with terrain or in-flight breakup. With most spatial disorientation accidents, the pilot does not recognize the problem, or at least does not recognize it in time, to effectively recover the situation. The unrecognized spatial disorientation, often known as Type 1, can occur from an extended period of time lasting up to 10 seconds or even longer. A range of factors can influence the extent to which a pilot may experience spatial disorientation or be able to recover from spatial disorientation. Common factors include limited and ambiguous visual clues outside the cockpit, not directly sufficient attention to the flight instruments due to workload or distraction, and not being proficient in instrument flying skills. Research. The Atsb report, an overview of spatial disorientation as a factor in aviation accidents and incidents, found that spatial disorientation is among the most common factors contributing to aviation accidents and incidents. This study, which is available at the Atsb website, www.atsb.gov.au, provides a comprehensive explanation of the various types of spatial disorientation in the aviation environment and suggests strategies for managing the risk associated with spatial disorientation. Related occurrences. Many aircraft accidents have occurred at night, as stamped in CAAP 5.13-2. Night flying accidents are not as frequent as daytime accidents because less flying is done at night. However, statistics indicate that an accident at night is about 2.5 times more likely to be fatal than an accident during the day. Further, accidents at night that result from controlled or uncontrolled flight into terrain, CFIT or UFIT, are very likely to be fatal accidents. Loss of control by pilots in night VFR aircraft in dark night conditions has been a factor in a significant number of fatal accidents in this country. The Atsb has investigated several occurrences involving VFR flight into dark night conditions. One such circumstance was a VFR flight into dark conditions and loss of control involving a Piper PA-28, Papa Oscar Juliet, which occurred 31 kilometres north of Horsham on the 15th of August 2011. Another such flight was a VFR flight into dark night conditions involving an Aerospatial AS-355. It's a helicopter registered as November Tango Victor, which occurred 145 kilometres north of Moree in South Australia, 18th of August 2011. VFR flight into night conditions and loss of control involving a Cessna 210, registered Mike Echo Quebec, occurring 2 kilometres northwest of Roma Airport in Queensland on the 25th of March 2013. The safety analysis. During solo night circuit consolidation training in dark night conditions, the aircraft collided with terrain following a go-around. The Atsb identified that the pilot satisfied the requirement to undertake the training, and that while a degree of post-impact fire prevented a complete examination, no evidence was found of a mechanical fault with the aircraft or engine. The analysis will discuss a loss of control and potential reasons for the loss, including the pilot's medical history, the ambient conditions of the night, and the aircraft's configuration. The occurrence. It could not be determined why the pilot conducted a go-around. However, it was a normal procedure, and he was trained to do so if not stabilised by 300 feet above ground level on final approach. Reported increase in crosswinds and minor turbulence in the circuit may have conflicted the position of the aircraft and influenced the pilot's decision to go around. However, there was insufficient evidence to determine whether that was the case. Examination of the aircraft wreckage and accident site identified that the aircraft collided with terrain while turning to the right with a slight nose-down attitude and at a high speed. In the context of that apparent departure from the controlled flight, the Atsb considered several possibilities for the loss of control. Aircraft configuration. The aircraft's flaps were found to have probably been in the fully extended 40-degree position at impact. This was contrary to the operator's go-around procedures and the student pilot's training and their use of flaps in previous night circuits. As a result, the Atsb considered the potential for this configuration to have contributed to the loss of control. It's possible the flaps were inadvertently set to 40 degrees during the approach and not retracted during the go-around. If this was the case, climb performance and acceleration during the upwind leg of the circuit would have been reduced. The need for the pilot to wait for the airspeed and or rate climb to increase prior to retracting the flaps would have prolonged the situation. The Atsb could not determine if the use of 40-degree flap impacted the pilot's ability to control the aircraft. However, if the pilot's instrument scan deteriorated while dealing with the effects of the unanticipated configuration, they may have become susceptible to spatial disorientation. The pilot would have had very little time, if any, experience dealing with this situation. Pilot medical condition. The pilot's post-mortem examination revealed a congenital heart anomaly that the examining pathologist advised could not be completely excluded from having precipitated a cardiac event. No other evidence was found to support or oppose an incapacitation event as contributing to the loss of control following the go-around radio call. The student pilot had previously been treated for an attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and last filled a prescription for medication to treat the symptoms 23 months before the accident. The degree, if any, to which the pilot was still affected by this condition at the time of the accident could not be determined, as no specialist aviation medical assessments were performed following the cessation of the medication. Similar, due to the limited available information, conclusive medical advice on the potential for the condition to have influenced the accident was not possible. However, given the known effects of ADHD on aviation, any residual effects may have, if present, impacted on the pilot's ability to manage the aircraft in unexpected circumstances affecting the go-around. Dark night conditions. The student pilot's training records indicate that, in accordance with the relevant Civil Aviation Safety Authority CASA requirements, they were adequately trained to perform solar night circuits. Despite this training, the pilot had limited experience flying at night. The risk of spatial disorientation during dark night conditions can be increased by any distraction that diverts a pilot's attention from the aircraft's flight instruments. In this occurrence, it remains possible that ADHD symptoms, if present, may have impacted on the pilot's ability to give sufficient attention to the flight instruments. Similar, as previously mentioned, the pilot may have been distracted by a possible flap misconfiguration or fault. In either case, there was insufficient evidence to determine the contribution of each of these potential hazards to this accident. However, with most accidents involving spatial disorientation, the pilot does not recognise the problem or does not recognise it in time to effectively recover from the situation. Knowledge of the pilot's medical condition. It was reported by the chief flying instructor that the student pilot disclosed their previous treatment for ADHD to the flying school. However, as the pilot had passed the Class 1 medical examination, the flying school assumed that the pilot's previous condition no longer represented an ongoing safety risk. In addition, the pilot performance as a student was regarded as satisfactory. For reasons that could not be conclusively determined, CASA was unaware of the pilot's previous treatment for ADHD, and this precluded their consideration for any implications of the pilot's condition before joining the Airline Pilot Cadet Scheme. An awareness of the condition would have allowed CASA to, if required, invoke an appropriate surveillance regime that likely would have involved and therefore informed the operator and reduced safety risk. Findings. From the evidence available, the following findings are made with respect to the loss of control and collision with terrain involving Cessna 182 Romeo registered Alpha Uniform Tango, which occurred near Hamilton Airport in Victoria, Australia on the 23rd of September 2013. These findings should not be read as an appropriate blame or liability to any particular organisation or individual. Contributing factors. Following a go-around during night circuit consolidation trainings, the aircraft departed controlled flight and collided with terrain. Other factors that increased risk. The pilot had an undiagnosed heart anomaly and that predisposed him to cardiac event and incapacitation. For reasons that could not be conclusively determined, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority was unaware of the student's prior treatment for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, preventing its consideration and management of any ongoing safety risk associated with the condition. Other findings. The post-mortem examination was unable to completely exclude the possibility that the accident was precipitated by a cardiac event. The source of information for this final report were the aircraft operator, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, CASA, an attention deficit hyperactivity disorder medical specialist, a number of witnesses, the Bureau of Meteorology, the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, Victoria Police, and the Cessna Aircraft Company. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau, ATSB, is an independent Commonwealth Government statutory agency. The ATSB is governed by a commission and is entirely separate from the transport regulators, policymakers, and service providers. The ATSB function is to improve safety and public confidence in the aviation, marine, and rail modes of transport. This is done through excellence in independent investigations of transport accidents and other safety occurrences, safety data recording, analysis, and research, fostering safety awareness, knowledge, and action. The ATSB performed its function in accordance with the provisions of the Transport Safety Investigation Act of 2003 and regulations, and where applicable, relevant international agreements. Purpose of safety investigations. The object of a safety investigation is to identify and reduce safety-related risk. ATSB investigations determine and communicate the factors related to the transport safety matter being investigated. It's not a function of the ATSB to apportion blame or determine liability. At the same time, an investigation report must include factual material of sufficient weight to support the analysis and findings. At all times, the ATSB endeavours to balance the use of material that could imply adverse comment with the need to properly explain what happened and why in a fair and unbiased manner. With the exception of the coat of arms, Atsb logo, and photos and graphics on which third party holds copyright, this publication is licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 Australia licence. Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 Australia licence is a standard form of license agreement that allows you to copy, distribute, transmit, and adapt this publication provided that you attribute the work. This aircraft accident investigation podcast was sourced from the Australian Transport Safety Bureau. For the official report, please visit their website www.atsb.gov.au.